December 16, 1944. In the first light of the morning, the forests of the Ardennes trembled under the German advance. In Berlin, General Alfred Jodl smiled at the map. If they don't see it, they won't be able to react. Hitler's last offensive, shrouded in silence and fog, promised to break through the Allied lines and regain the initiative on the Western Front. It was the rebirth of the Blitzkrieg. And no one, not even the most cautious among the generals, believed that the Americans would have an answer. After all, the United States war, they said, was slow, heavy, and predictable. That confidence, almost doctrinal, was about to be torn by heaven. Without warning, without plane, without forward observer, the Wehrmacht soldiers heard the first whistle. It was not an airstrike. It was not a traditional bombing. It was something new, something that fell from above and exploded before touching the ground. From that moment on, the battlefield would become a laboratory of applied physics and death, an invisible equation. This documentary reveals how an ignored weapon, born of science and powered by anonymous assembly lines, dismantled entire formations and challenged everything the German army believed it knew about war. That winter, the sky became an enemy. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story with surgical precision. On the night of December 25, 1944, 702 German bodies were counted over the fragmented ice of the Sauer River. No American platoon approached. No aircraft flew overhead. They were crossing a river at night in fog. Invisible, they believed. But there were no more hiding places. The projectile no longer needed eyes. The enemy was being shot down by weapons that could sense his presence. At that moment, the logic of war collapsed. And it all started with an act of disobedience. A colonel who defied orders and unleashed a weapon the world didn't yet know. If you value the accuracy of facts, historical memory, and the power of technical analysis, consider supporting this work with your like and subscription. This keeps the story behind the numbers alive. In November 1944, as the Allies slowly advanced into the heart of Germany, Adolf Hitler summoned his generals for one last desperate gamble. The Western Front seemed vulnerable. American morale had been eroded by months of urban battles in France, and the British and Canadian armies were scattered. There was, according to the Nazi High Command, a breach. The idea was brutal and old: to gather 200,000 troops, more than 1,000 tanks, nearly 2,000 guns, and advance with the full force of a reinvented Blitzkrieg, pounding American lines where they least expected it, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The objective was strategic: to divide the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a peace negotiation on the Western Front. For many within the Wehrmacht, this offensive would be Germany's last chance to turn the tide. Nazi intelligence estimated that the United States would not react quickly. The conviction was almost doctrinaire. Americans depended too much on air superiority, slow supplies, centralized communications. German troops would be invisible in the fog. The advance would be fulminant. There was a firm belief in the command that technologically, the United States was heavy, backward, and slow. They have money, we have brains, noted an officer of the 6th Panzer Division. But this analysis did not take into account an essential variable: scale. American industrial capacity had already been tested in multiple theaters of war and exceeded all expectations. What appeared to be slowness was actually logistical depth. While the German generals boasted of their speed, the Americans were building an arsenal of war that didn't need to run, only crush. In 1944, the United States produced more than 88,000 aircraft per year, compared to just over 25,000 in Germany. More than 60,000 tanks had been manufactured since 1940, and that same year, U.S. artillery shell production exceeded that of the Wehrmacht by almost 10 times. The German war was a tactical precision race. The American war was becoming a mathematical operation, and the Germans didn't know that. But there was an even more overlooked detail: U.S. investment in applied military science. Behind the scenes of the war, far from the battlefields, American laboratories were working on invisible weapons, sensors, circuits, miniaturization. The proximity fuse project itself, which would automatically detonate over enemy troops, had already consumed more than $1 billion in secret funding, involving 134 companies and about 15,000 scientists. Germany did not even suspect that such devices were ready for the battlefield. And worse, He believed it was impossible to integrate them into conventional artillery. German confidence was rooted in an outdated portrayal of the enemy. To the high command, the Americans were workers, not soldiers. Their warfare was waged by fat men sitting behind tanks without doctrine, without martial honor. It was the old Prussian vision: discipline against improvisation, technique against volume. But by the winter of 1944, that vision was weeks away from being shattered by the weight of American industry. To give an example, while Germany was already struggling to maintain supplies of basic ammunition, the U.S. produced, in that month of December, an artillery shell with a proximity fuse every 2 seconds. If this scale surprises you, write in the comments, "absolute power," because that's exactly what was being put on the field, without the Germans even realizing it. The German plan was sound on paper: a surprise attack, infiltration with disguised commands, devastating initial bombardment. But all of this depended on one factor: that Americans respond in a predictable way, that they retreated, that they didn't have time, that it would take days to organize artillery and reconnaissance, that they could not see, that they could not calculate, that they could not react. But they were wrong. And the first deadly mistake would come at Monschau, where an American colonel decided on his own to activate a weapon that his superiors had not yet authorized. The order was ignored. The sky, from then on, began to explode on its own, and the German formations began to disappear without understanding what was hitting them. This turning point starts with a name, an officer, a gesture, and a choice that will challenge the American military hierarchy itself. That's what we'll see now. In the first weeks of December 1944, the Ardennes sector was seen by the American High Command as a resting point, a relatively quiet area, occupied by exhausted units, recently arrived from the French front, and by inexperienced recruits sent there precisely to recover, resupply, and reorganize. The roads were covered with snow. The mountainous and forested terrain made large-scale maneuvers difficult, and for this very reason, intelligence analyses ruled out any possibility of a German attack in large numbers in that region. Reports from the G2, the intelligence service of the 12th Army Group, pointed to low enemy movement, few radio signals, and no unusual air activity. It was, in the words of General Bradley, the last place they would try anything. Confidence was such that the sector was handed over to weakened divisions. Among them, formations such as the 106th Infantry Division, composed of young soldiers with no real combat experience, stood out. The atmosphere was one of almost tactical negligence. But while the Americans let their guard down, the German army operated with surgical precision in the shadows. For weeks, veteran troops were secretly repositioned. Tanks were hidden by natural smoke screens. Artillery pieces were camouflaged inside barns, woods, and narrow valleys. And when the attack finally began, at 5:30 a.m. on the morning of the 16th, the impact was total. The sky exploded with more than 1,600 German artillery rounds per minute on an 85-mile front. It was the largest bombardment since the initial offensive on the Eastern Front. The sound was deafening. The earth trembled, and for long minutes, chaos engulfed the American lines. In many sectors, communications have been cut off. Field commanders reported collapse of the response system. The enemy seemed to arise from all sides at once. The 99th Infantry Division was crushed in its forward positions. The 106th, surrounded and isolated, lost thousands of men in days. In less than 48 hours, the Germans had created a bulge of more than 80 kilometers inside the Allied lines. In the command rooms in Paris, the shock was total. None of the top American generals, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, expected this move. The enemy, who seemed defeated, had reappeared with strength, discipline, and organization. American confidence, built up in months of continuous advance, was now torn apart under the snow. And as eyes turned to the large armies, a forgotten unit faced its own collapse. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, positioned near Monschau, was one of the first to feel the brunt of the German onslaught. Surrounded, isolated, and outnumbered, the squadron called for desperate artillery support. But the local command faced a dilemma. Standard batteries were failing to stem the advance. The distance was too short for corrections. The defensive line was beginning to crumble. And at the center of this stalemate was one man, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, commander of the 406th Field Artillery Group. Axelson was a methodical, technical, disciplined officer, but above all, pragmatic. With experience of operations in North Africa and Italy, he had learned a simple truth. Blind obedience in combat can cost the battle, and at that moment, everything indicated that the battle there was already lost. He knew that he had, in his warehouses, an experimental weapon, a sealed box with shells marked for authorized use in anti-aircraft defense only. Proximity fuses had been banned from land use by direct order of the High Command. It was feared that if captured, the Germans might decipher their operation. But Axelson also knew something else. His men were minutes away from being crushed, and conventional artillery no longer had any effect. He looked at the map, listened to the requests coming from the radio, and made the decision. No permission, no consultation. He ordered the fuses to be attached to the shells and fired at the German formations. It was a direct order, given under the weight of desperation, and one that would turn the tide of the battle. No superior was informed. No specialist was consulted. In a matter of minutes, the first battery was armed, and then it soared. The effect would be immediate and devastating. Axelson didn't know it, but he had just begun the largest real field test of a technology that, until then, had been considered theoretical, and the first targets were about to discover, in the worst possible way, that there was no longer any security in the methods they knew. When the shells exploded in midair, German doctrine began to crumble. But before this was understood, another American unit, isolated, surrounded, with its name etched in history, would also receive this secret weapon, and with it would come a resistance that no German general had foreseen. Bastogne was surrounded, but she was not defenseless. Oscar Alfred Axelson was just one more colonel among hundreds in the United States military. With a technical background and a history of campaigning in hostile scenarios, his reputation was solid but discreet. He was not known for daring acts nor for breaking structures. But on the morning of December 16, 1944, faced with the imminent collapse of his line of defense, Axelson made a decision he was not authorized to make, a decision that violated War Department guidelines, contradicted Allied Expeditionary Force security protocols, and could, in theory, put him under military trial. He ordered his gunners to use projectiles equipped with a component that until then had been confined to use in aerial situations, the proximity fuse. The device, developed in absolute secrecy by American laboratories and tested in controlled environments, was a milestone in war technology. Unlike time fuses, which required meticulous calculations, or impact fuses, which only worked in direct contact, the proximity fuse carried a miniaturized radar system capable of measuring the distance to the target during flight and detonating the warhead at the most lethal height possible. It was essentially a smart weapon, capable of thinking in midair. The fear, however, was not technical. It was strategic. There was a clear clause. Fuses were not, under any circumstances, to be used in ground combat without express approval from the High Command. The logic was simple. If the Germans captured an unexploded shell, they could reverse engineer it and develop countermeasures. General Eisenhower himself had personally signed this order. The weapon was effective, but it was still a secret. Axelson knew this, but he also knew that his position was about to be destroyed. The 38th Cavalry Squadron was isolated. His flanks had given way. Conventional artillery no longer had any effect. The German formations advanced in line, protected by ditches, trees, and trenches. The impact on the ground was not enough. A new vector was needed, an angle that the doctrine did not cover, and that's exactly what he triggered. Without hesitation, he ordered the sealed stocks to be opened. The grenades were loaded, the tubes adjusted, and the first shot was fired. A 105 mm projectile, equipped with an electronic brain the size of a coffee can, cut through the sky above Monschau. When it reached about 15 meters from the ground, it exploded, and everything changed. The air burst generated a fragmentation cone that hit soldiers in ditches, behind trees, inside trenches. What was once shelter was now a trap. The concept of a safe zone has been abolished, and the enemy advance, until then methodical and confident, stopped. The Germans did not understand. For them, artillery followed rules, a cadence, a distance, a rhythm. They knew where to step, where to bend down, when to run. But none of this worked anymore. The projectiles did not obey the ground. They were guided by the air. Each shot created a storm of shrapnel in mid-flight, hitting invisible targets with almost mathematical precision. It was the beginning of a new era, The war had gained a third axis, the vertical. Axelson didn't just break the chain of command. He introduced a new paradigm to the battlefield. The field is no longer just a horizontal space for maneuvering and has become a three-dimensional volume of risk. The enemy could now die before he even understood where the attack was coming from. And all this was done without consultation, without a manual, without endorsement. The courage of an officer, isolated and pressured, broke the limits of military obedience. It was the victory of the field logic over the bureaucracy of the cabinet. There was no immediate record. No medals were awarded. No official note has been published. But that morning, the advancing enemy was stopped by a concept he didn't understand. And among the frozen trees, a new kind of silence began to form, the silence of doubt. Because for the first time, the German soldiers did not know what was hitting them. They couldn't adapt tactics. They couldn't react. What they had faced was not just fire. It was something I thought, calculated, felt, and it could not be seen. In the following days, the German command would seek explanations. Technicians would be summoned, and denial would be the first response. But one of its top engineers, when analyzing the wreckage of captured shells, would say a phrase that would be recorded in a report. If the Americans really made it work, then we lost more than one battle. They had wasted time. And on the battlefield, time, once lost, never returns. In the next part, the viewer will see how American engineering made the impossible work, designing a functional radar that withstood 20,000 times the force of gravity at full fire, all packaged in a tube smaller than a coffee cup. Because when science decides to go into combat, the battlefield changes forever. When Oscar Axelson ordered the firing of the first projectiles equipped with proximity fuses, he set in motion a chain of events that had begun not on the battlefield, but in laboratories, workshops, and factories scattered throughout the United States. What exploded in the sky over Belgium that frozen December was actually the result of one of the most ambitious and secretive scientific operations of World War II. Called the VT fuse by the military and Project P by its engineers, the proximity fuse was more than a detonation device. It was a complete miniature radar system embedded inside an artillery shell, designed to detect approaching ground or a target and automatically explode at the optimal height to maximize lethality. Each fuse carried about 130 components, including 4 or 5 thermoionic valves, the vacuum tubes, adapted to withstand extreme forces. When fired, the projectile suffered an acceleration of up to 20,000 times Earth's gravity, something that would instantly destroy any conventional electronic equipment of the time. But the fuse valves didn't just survive. They worked. The secret was in miniaturization engineering, led by physicist Dr. Merle Tuve. Scientists at Johns Hopkins University worked quietly, isolated from the world, in a building that on the outside looked like a used car dealership, but inside operated under safety protocols equivalent to the Manhattan Project. There, vacuum tubes of less than 2 centimeters were developed, capable of operating in rotation, extreme heat, absolute cold, and very high pressure. When they were launched, a glass ampule inside the fuse broke, releasing electrolyte that activated a short-lived battery. This battery powered a radio transmitter that emitted pulses at a frequency between 180 and 220 megahertz. When these waves found the ground or a target, they returned. The strength of the reflected signal increased exponentially as the projectile approached the surface. When the signal reached the pre-programmed threshold, a detonation circuit was activated. The projectile exploded about 10 to 50 feet off the ground, depending on the model. The practical effect was devastating. The airburst released shrapnel in 360 degrees, creating a fragmentation cone that turned the sky into blades. The trenches, once safe, became death chambers. Tactics based on static coverage completely lost their meaning. No amount of protection was sufficient against a weapon that understood its position in space. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The concept of radar was already known. Germany had made remarkable advances in the field of electronics. But while German engineers worked under a regime that demanded immediate results and sacrificed medium-term research, the Americans were betting on something that seemed, at the time, impossible, putting a radar inside a bullet, and they succeeded. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this, because details often change the course of the story. By 1944, The United States was producing more than 40,000 proximity fuses per day. RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, Emerson Radio, and more than 100 other companies were converted to manufacture the device. No employee knew exactly what they were building. The parts were assembled in watertight compartments with extreme quality controls. Each vacuum tube was tested individually. Each weld was inspected under magnification. Samples were fired in real ballistic tests to validate resistance. And even with this rigor, American industry managed to lower the unit cost from $732 at the beginning of the project to only as $18 per unit by the end of 1944. The strategic impact was brutal. With more than 22 million units produced during the war, the United States had created the first generation of smart ammunition on an industrial scale, and the Germans, even when they captured unexploded specimens, they couldn't believe it. When analyzing the vacuum tubes, Wehrmacht engineers declared the device to be a fake, a distraction. In the German doctrinal mentality, a projectile could not contain a functional circuit, let alone survive the shot. It was the defeat of technical arrogance in the face of industrial persistence. A German intelligence report dated January 1945 belatedly concluded, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled fuse that detonates at the ideal height. There is no possible defense. We are at a disadvantage." But this realization only emerged when it was too late. The next installment reveals just that, what happened when these fuses got into the hands of soldiers in the field, and how the sound of explosions in the air began to replace tactical command itself, because from that moment on, science began to decide who lives and who disappears. On the freezing dawn of December 17, 1944, on the outskirts of Monschau, the frozen ground seemed to amplify every step, every breath, every movement of the German troops of the 326th Volunteer Grenadier Division. They were veterans. Many had survived the Eastern Front, braving the Russian winter, Soviet artillery, and the relentless advance of T-34 tanks. They knew the sounds of war like few others. They knew how to identify, by their crest, the direction of a cannon, the cadence of a machine gun, the threat of an artillery piece. But that day, the sound was different. American artillery was no longer slamming into the ground. It left no craters on the roads. It didn't explode behind the lines or miss by meters. The sound came from above, a shorter whistle, a dry, suspended detonation, and then the air would break. The shells now exploded more than 10 meters high, at the exact point where their shrapnel could cover as much area as possible. And that included everything: shallow trenches, positions in dense forest, soldiers on the march. The aerial fragmentation generated a circular rain of steel that descended at unpredictable angles. The trees stopped protecting. The trenches were no longer hidden. The doctrine of coverage was obsolete. Experienced men, trained to cringe in the face of an impact, now looked up and didn't know what to do. The effect was immediate. The formations began to lose cohesion. Platoons that had been advancing in a standard line were broken up in seconds. In a stretch of forest, 12 soldiers were found huddled in a hole, killed by a single shot that detonated over their heads. There were no marks on the ground. There was no warning. The air was the enemy. The fire no longer needed line of sight. He calculated alone, measured alone, exploded alone. The Wehrmacht's tactics, hitherto ruthless on closed ground, failed. Units that fanned out to avoid concentrated casualties became more exposed targets for aerial fragmentation. Those that grouped together for mutual cover disappeared under a single explosion. The Americans, initially as surprised as their enemies, soon realized what they had in their hands. Artillery observers no longer had to make manual corrections. All he had to do was shoot. The proximity fuse took care of the rest. The volume of fire remained constant, but effectiveness jumped. The time between the detection of a target and its destruction has been reduced to minutes. It wasn't just superiority. It was war economy. An American battalion could inflict 3 times as many casualties with the same amount of ammunition. A projectile that exploded on the ground hit, on average, a lethal area of 30 square meters. With a proximity fuse, this area rose to more than 120 square meters, an increase of almost 400%. What once required coordinated bursts could now be done with surgical and mathematical precision. But what devastated the Germans most was not physical destruction. It was psychological panic. It was a war with no prior sound, no pattern, no tactical logic. Experienced soldiers began to report bouts of anxiety. The term Luftminen, aerial mines, began to circulate among the troops as an attempt to name something that was not understood. One captured officer would later confess, "We no longer knew whether to run, duck, or pray. Everything seemed wrong." The irony was evident. Germany, which for years had relied on its tactical mastery, its iron discipline, and its Blitzkrieg-based offensive doctrine, now found itself paralyzed by a weapon that followed none of these rules. The Americans, until then seen as dependent on aviation, showed that their real strength lay in what no one saw, in science, production, and logistics. Psychological fragmentation spread like fire in dry grass. Elite troops began to hesitate. Entire units asked to retreat. Internal reports mentioned disorganized retreat due to unidentified aerial fire. And while the German army tried to understand what was happening, new shipments of shells were already being distributed to other American battalions. The gun was no longer an exception. It had become standard. Behind the scenes, Allied officers quickly understood the impact. The war had changed, and whoever controlled the sky, not with planes but with sensors, would control the ground. But the decisive moment was yet to come, because among the besieged positions, isolated under snow and fire, a city held out with few men, scarce ammunition, and a limited supply of these invisible shells. And there, in the ruins of Bastogne, proximity fuses would not only defend a strategic position, they would redefine the notion of resistance under siege. On the other side of the front line, incredulity was mixed with despair. The Ardennes offensive, intended to be the final blow of the Third Reich, now faced a weapon that made no sense within the parameters of German doctrine. The accounts of the survivors of the first impact began to circulate with vague and almost superstitious terms. Explosions in the air, invisible attacks, artillery that thinks. The German command elite, made up of engineers, strategists, and veterans, found no logic. There were no sensors detected, no planes sighted, no new artillery pieces visible. The initial response was skepticism. The technical experts of the High Command demanded proof. When they finally captured unexploded shells, the shock was absolute. Inside the warhead, housed with millimeter precision, were electronic components, miniature vacuum tubes, circuits sealed in wax, and a radio transmitter operating between 180 and 220 MHz. The verdict was unanimous. Impossible. No electronic technology, and let alone vacuum-based, could survive the firing of an artillery piece. The German engineers refused at first to believe that it worked. They declared that the Americans must be disguising some electrostatic mechanism. Some even suggested that the components were fake, part of a disinformation operation. The irony was overwhelming. By 1940, even before the United States entered the war, Germany already had working prototypes of proximity fuses. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin have tested models based on capacitive principles with success rates of over 90%. But then came Adolf Hitler's direct order. All weapons projects that took more than 6 months to go into production were to be cancelled. "The war will be won with what we have now," he said. The fuses were filed. The team was redeployed, and Germany, a world leader in physics, radio frequency, and ballistics, abandoned the technology that would define the war. The German doctrine, which had always prided itself on its scientific rationality and the superiority of its engineering, collapsed in the face of its own impatience. They had become convinced that war was a matter of months, and that each project should deliver immediate impact. The long term was a luxury that the Reich could no longer afford. Meanwhile, the Americans, initially slow, bet on the marathon. Johns Hopkins University, tucked under the facade of an abandoned dealership in Maryland, brought together hundreds of physicists every day who tweaked, tested, and perfected the miniature radar systems of the fuses. The investment would exceed $1 billion by the end of the war, an amount comparable to the Manhattan Project. What the Germans called irrational production was actually strategic planning. The difference was one of philosophy. For Germany, the engineer served the general. For the United States, the general listened to the engineer. American production, in turn, defied any precedent. By December 1944, more than 100 American factories were manufacturing components for the fuses. The Crosley Corporation, until then specialized in refrigerators, assembled the enclosures. Emerson Radio produced the transmitters. Sylvania, miniaturized vacuum tubes. The tracking system was so accurate that each fuse had a unique serial number, and any defect was traceable back to the welder in charge. The quality system, previously non-existent in large-scale war production, was reinvented. Each weld was tested. Each tube was inspected under augmentation, and before they were dispatched, random samples of fuses were triggered in real tests. The success rate exceeded 80% in combat. When analysts from the Abwehr, the German intelligence service, finally accepted that the weapon was real, they didn't know how to answer. In a report dated January 10, 1945, the Wehrmacht's Western Command admitted, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates the ammunition at the optimum height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused serious casualties among our troops. There are no effective countermeasures." The recognition came too late. Germany's industrial reserves were already at their limit. The Luftwaffe could barely fuel its fighters. Panzer IV tanks were being assembled from repurposed parts. There were no materials, time, or energy to replicate such advanced technology. And once again, historical irony imposed itself. Germany, which during the 1930s led the world in electronics and applied physics, was now the victim of a backwardness of its own choosing. The impact was more than military. It was ideological. Officers trained in the belief of Germanic superiority faced the reality of a defeat caused not by courage or numbers, but by invisible microcomponents. A gun that didn't scream, but whispered on radar. A weapon that did not march, but hovered. Hermann Göring, during his post-war interrogation, is reported to have said, "Our scientists warned about American fuses. I didn't believe it. I thought it was impossible." He was right. It was impossible, within the world in which Germany still believed it lived. But the battlefield was no longer that. War was now decided in the laboratories, on the assembly lines, in the management of supplies. There was no honor in ignoring innovation. There was defeat. And the Germans, who in 1939 had shocked the world with their advances, now succumbed to a weapon they could have created themselves, and chose not to. But the full impact was yet to come, because at Bastogne, the encircled Americans would face the apex of the German attack, and there, with few men and few resources, the proximity of technology and victory would be tested to the limit. Among the icy rubble of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division did not look like a force about to write one of the most unlikely victories of the war. They were surrounded on all sides. Supply paths had been cut off. Aviation was impeded by the weather. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees C. And yet General McAuliffe's men held their ground, not out of blind bravery, but out of an invisible advantage that most soldiers did not even understand. They were armed with something the enemy did not possess: artillery equipped with proximity fuses. The 150mm pieces of American artillery, carefully positioned in clearings and depressions around the city, were fed by limited but strategic stocks of these smart shells. And at each German attack, all it took was for a fire coordinator to raise his binoculars and signal, "Start VT fire." The result was always the same. Columns of German infantry, formed with discipline and ready for frontal assault, evaporated in minutes. A single shot exploded in the air, and the snow that fell around it was tinged with red and silence. The soldiers in Bastogne began to notice something curious. The attacks ceased faster than usual. There was no need for direct fire. The enemy couldn't seem to get close. It was as if the artillery itself had gained eyes and a will. The reports of the field observers are clear. German grenadiers, on a coordinated march, being torn apart before reaching the lines. And more, entire formations that did not return to report what had hit them. It was the invisible that killed, and that created something new inside the American trenches. Faith. Faith in science. The faith that even without air cover and reinforcements, there was something on his side that the enemy could not explain. One battery commander even declared, "We have no food, we have no clothes, but we have heaven, and now, heaven is ours." The tactical impact was only part of the equation. The real earthquake was in the moral field, because the soldiers of the 101st, accustomed to operating with mobility and air support, were now fixed, vulnerable, and out of supplies. But for the first time, they possessed a game-changing weapon even before the line of contact. It was not a defense. It was an absolute denial of advancement. No German frontal attack on Bastogne, after regular use of fuses, succeeded in breaking through the defensive perimeter. None. The artillery, which normally served as a rearguard, now decided the moment of enemy defeat. What's more, it did so with fewer projectiles. The math was clear. A post-battle study showed that during the siege, the effectiveness rate of near-fuse projectiles was 4 times higher than that of conventional explosions. For every 5 VT shots, the same suppression effect was achieved as it previously required 20. In times of scarcity, this was gold, or rather, applied science. And here is a fact that the Germans ignored, or pretended not to see. By December 1944, the United States was producing more than 40,000 proximity fuses per day. Germany? 0. The project had been canceled by Hitler 4 years earlier. If this number surprises you, write in the comments. Shocking data. Because in the end, the war was decided by those who knew how to wait, plan, and trust. The Germans, who had just marched confidently over the Ardennes, now retreated in silence. One of the Wehrmacht's field commanders reportedly confided in January, "I don't know where to hide anymore. They shoot, and the air kills us." Bastogne did not fall. Backwards. The city has become a symbol, an icon of how industrial discipline and American technological audacity were able to sustain positions even under total siege. And in that ice, among bullets, prayers and censors, something greater was born. The conviction that modern war belonged to those who knew how to integrate morals, logic, and microelectronics. But there was still one place where this weapon would show its full power: an open field, a night crossing, and more than 700 German soldiers unknowingly headed for the largest ground-air massacre of the campaign. While the smoke from Bastogne still hung over the frozen fields of Belgium, the real force behind the American victories continued to operate thousands of miles away. No fuss, no uniforms, no glory. It was a force invisible to the eyes of the German generals, but with a devastating impact: the industry of the United States. In December 1944, as besieged soldiers fought for hours on end, American factories were at an unprecedented pace of production. More than 40,000 proximity fuses were mounted per day, 7 days a week. Each unit had about 130 components, and each of them was tested individually. Nothing was left to chance. The standard of quality bordered on obsession. RCA, which specializes in home radios, began to produce millimeter transmitters. Sylvania, which previously manufactured lamps and radios, began to develop cathode-reinforced vacuum tubes adapted to ballistic pressure. Emerson Radio assembled circuits in series operating with the precision of relays that couldn't miss. A single short circuit, and the warhead would become useless. To avoid failure, civilian workers were trained to weld under microscopes, in 12-hour shifts, without knowing what they were building. It was not blind patriotism. It was a silent pact with efficiency. More than 100 companies were incorporated into the effort, each one converted overnight into war gear. And they all operated on a central premise: no detail is too small when lives are at stake. The success of this machine did not come only from technology. It came from coordination. The Office of Naval Research, the NDRC, National Defense Research Committee, and the Army operated as a single core. Orders passed directly from the scientists to the production managers. The bureaucracy was overwhelmed by urgency. War needed precision, and American industrial democracy delivered this with brutal efficiency. Each consignment of fuses was numbered, traceable, and accompanied by test batches. Each week, random samples were taken from the line, fired at Aberdeen or in the Nevada desert, and evaluated for heat resistance, impact, vibration, and accuracy. Only the best went to the front. What the Germans did not know or refused to accept was that behind every shot that exploded at their troops were hundreds of anonymous hands. Women, teenagers, immigrants, metal workers who never picked up a rifle, but who won battles with welds, screws, and vacuum. Nazi doctrine could never have foreseen that a people in civilian clothes, working in makeshift factories, could beat an elite trained in military academies. By 1944, the United States had already surpassed the combined war production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. For every 1 mortar manufactured by Germany, the U.S. manufactured 12. For every 1 Messerschmitt plane, there were 7 B-17 bombers. For every 1 Panzer IV tank, 5 Shermans left the American lines. But it wasn't just volume. It was constancy. It was redundancy. It was logistics. When the Germans bombed Allied factories, production migrated to another plant in another state with another supplier. The system was flexible, scalable, and resilient. It was the triumph of planning over centralization, and within this ecosystem, the proximity fuse became a symbol of silent supremacy. It didn't need advertising. It just worked, and that was enough. In contrast, Germany was collapsing. By January 1945, German industry was no longer able to supply its own divisions with enough ammunition. The Luftwaffe had practically ceased to exist as an offensive force. Tanks were being produced without radios, due to the shortage of copper. Troops were given orders by messengers on horseback. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, 65,000 workers kept the production line of the VT project running 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, non-stop, with supply guaranteed by a coordinated rail network, supported by 135,000 wagons dedicated to military transport. The difference between the two powers was not just material. She was philosophical. Germany was betting on miraculous weapons, rockets, jets, supertanks. The United States was betting on consistency, reliability, and integration between science, production, and the field. And that's what won the war. Because it's not just about inventing, it is about making invention accessible, reliable, and abundant. The greatest innovation is not technical, it is logistical. And by the time the enemy finally understood this, it was too late. The German bodies would still lie on the ice of the Sauer River for weeks. They were counted. 702 killed in a single night, without a patrol touching them, without a fighter chasing them. They were just in the wrong place, under the wrong sky, and in front of a nation that had learned to manufacture the invisible. In the next part, the war is no longer just a dispute between nations and becomes a matter of time, and who controls it. Because the Allies not only owned the sky, they began to anticipate their own future. As the winter of 1944 deepened, the silence between the bursts became more feared than the sound of gunfire itself. It was no longer just a physical war, of advances, retreats, and maneuvers. Something had changed on the front. A new sensation hung among the ranks, something between superstition and the rational certainty of death. And this change did not come from the armored vehicles, nor from the infantry, but from the sky. German soldiers who survived the first hits of the near-fused projectiles began to make names for what they did not understand. The most common among them, Totenglocke, the death bell. Others referred to the suspended explosions as Geiselhimmel, whips of heaven, terms loaded with symbolism, because it was not just about the explosion, it was what it represented, a weapon that knew where they were, a weapon that killed before contact, and more, that he killed from above, as if he came from an unattainable authority. The Wehrmacht's platoons, once known for their rigidity, began to break down. In campaign diaries found after the battle, reports of panic multiply. It exploded before the ground. The coverage did not help. They're hunting us like rats. There is nowhere to run. The fire is in the air. The terror was technical, but it became spiritual. How to combat something that is not seen, not heard until impact, and that seems to operate alone. The American artillery, now equipped mostly with VT fuses, no longer needed to adapt to the terrain. It was enough to mark the coordinates. Mathematics did the rest. And with each suspended explosion, the enemy troops learned a new lesson. The doctrine they had studied was no longer of any use. The impact among Americans was also visible, but for another reason. For many, it was the first time that a weapon of his provoked such a devastating, so clear, so automatic reaction. An artillery operator from the 9th Division reported, "We didn't need to see it. All you had to do was shoot. When the flash appeared from above, we knew they would not pass." There was admiration, but also discomfort. The efficiency of the fuse was almost impersonal. He killed from a distance, without emotion, without warning. And that made some veterans wonder if it was still war, or just execution. But on the battlefield, moral doubts are postponed, and effectiveness spoke louder. American troops besieged in villages, once accustomed to seeing Germans approach in waves, now watched the enemy disappear before reaching 300 meters. A battalion at Clairvaux recorded the annihilation of 3 enemy companies in less than 7 minutes. No rifle shots were fired, only artillery, only VT. And the more the news spread, the more fear did its job. It was not necessary for each shell to hit. It was enough to hear the sound, the high-pitched wheezing, the detonation suspended, the shadow that cut through the sky. In regions farther north, entire platoons began to hesitate in the face of open fields. A German sergeant taken prisoner confessed, "Before the explosion, You see the snow rise, as if something invisible had fallen, then just screams. Another officer reported that his men refused to leave the forests, even under direct orders. They preferred death by siege to crossing a plain under the invisible explosions. The doctrine of rapid advance, aggressive lines, coordinated assault. Everything collapsed. Now the war was coming from above, not planes, but of metal shells that heard, measured, and exploded with precision. It was as if the air itself had been set up, and the perceptions spread. When a weapon changes the enemy's behavior without being seen, it goes beyond the warlike function and enters the territory of the symbolic. The terror no longer came from armored divisions or the sound of Stukas diving. It came from the silence before the shot, from the dry snap at the top, the sound that shouldn't be there. Troops in the rear, who had not even been shot at, began to report nightmares about the phantom explosions. An Allied interrogation in January 1945 revealed that the mere mention of artillery bells was enough to reduce morale in reinforcement battalions. And here comes the historical irony. For years, the Germans had used fear as a psychological weapon, the Blitzkrieg, the bombings, the V-2 rockets. But now, unwittingly, they had taught the Americans how to win a war with the invisible. The proximity fuse didn't just kill, he bent the will of the enemy. And perhaps the cruelest thing was the fact that all of this had been possible without a new type of ammunition, without a new cannon, without a new vehicle, only with science, only with confidence in engineers, and above all, with patience, what Hitler despised. And that is why, by the end of the Ardennes campaign, what was left of many German units was not just the loss of men, but of doctrine. Faith in the method, in the discipline, in the geometry of the battlefield had been exchanged for the animal instinct to survive. But the war was not yet over, and soon, the Germans would realize that the United States had more than sensors and circuits. They had reach, they had air supremacy, and now, they had eyes in the sky and in their hands, because the next step would not only be to destroy what was on the ground, but to prevent anything from moving without being seen. The Ardennes offensive, carefully designed to be a surgical blow to the Allied line, reserved a key piece of disruption, the special commandos of the Waffen-SS, led by Otto Skorzeny. This was no ordinary battalion. Skorzeny, famous for rescuing Mussolini and known as the most dangerous man in Europe, had trained his men with obsessive precision. His troops were fluent in English, wore captured American uniforms, and drove Allied vehicles to sow mayhem behind the lines. The mission was daring: infiltrate, cut communications, sabotage bridges, manipulate signposts. Psychological warfare reached its apex, and, for a brief moment, it worked. Rumors of traitorous U.S. troops spread paranoia among the Allied forces. But Skorzeny didn't count on one factor. The Americans had turned eyes to the artillery. On December 21, 1944, his unit was advancing on the outskirts of Malmedy, covered by pine trees and protected by fog, the ideal formula for ambushes. The group, divided into cells, adopted irregular silent movement, tested in sabotage operations from Poland to Italy. No plane flew overhead, no drones existed, no patrol saw them, and yet they were hit. Without warning, no prior sound, no eye contact. The earth shook, but not under their feet, above their heads. The explosions occurred in the air, in the center of the formation. Shrapnel fell at a downward angle, forming a spherical rain that ignored trenches, thickets, rocks, or uniforms. A single shot broke up a detachment. The rest retreated in a hurry, not knowing where the attack was coming from. The surviving reports indicate a common feeling: disorientation. They didn't know if they had been discovered, if they were being pursued by unseen forces, or if there was some new kind of detection. The answer was simpler and more cruel. It didn't matter who they were, American, German, or civilian uniforms. The proximity fuse did not discriminate. What Skorzeny understood at that moment was devastating. Its greatest advantage, camouflage, had been nullified by an impersonal, automatic, industrial variable. The shells did not distinguish between elite troops and ordinary infantry. They did not react to human intelligence. They reacted from a distance, to presence, proximity. Mathematics could not be mistaken. Skorzeny's commandos, until then considered the technical elite of German irregular warfare, became common targets for a weapon that ignored hierarchies. And with that, The doctrine of military superiority collapsed from the inside out. If even the best were not able to move, infiltrate, or survive, what was left for the rest of the army? The impact was so profound that days later, the SS itself began an internal report to assess whether the advance should be halted until the new American method of defense was understood. But there was no method. There was technology and logistical discipline. While the commandos were trying to figure out how they had been located, the American gunners were already loading the next batch of shells, without ever having seen their targets. In Washington, Johns Hopkins engineers were already testing new sensors to adapt the same system to 90mm projectiles, capable of being fired by tanks. The evolution did not stop. War increasingly belonged to those who learned faster, and that was the problem for Germany. They had stopped learning. Hitler, increasingly paranoid, disbelieved in science that did not deliver immediate results. The generals relied more on maps than on data, and the elite commandos were now retreating under fire they could neither predict nor prevent. In later interrogations, captured officers confessed that the order, after Malmedy, was clear: avoid areas with a history of suspended aerial fire. In simple terms, the elite Waffen-SS had been transformed into ordinary infantry, with orders to bypass any zone where the Americans might be with artillery. Pride was replaced by precaution, doctrine by superstition. It was the beginning of the end, but not the end of innovation. Because while Germany was trying to understand what had hit it, the United States was already testing the use of the same system in airplanes and rockets. The war did not wait, and the Americans, now with sensors in the sky and algorithms in the field, were preparing their next card: to make the projectile think before it hits. At dawn on December 25, 1944, under a thick blanket of fog and silence, the 276th Volksgrenadier Regiment began crossing the Sauer River in the Echternach region. The goal was clear: to break through the fragile American lines on the West Bank, take advantage of the Christmas disorganization, and capture essential logistical positions. It was a studied, silent movement, calculated along the lines of the old German doctrine: tactical precision, climate as an ally, surprise as a weapon. But by that winter, physics had replaced strategy. When the first inflatable boats touched the opposite bank, nothing happened. American watchmen didn't even see them. There were no spotlights. There was no alarm. The crossing, for a few minutes, seemed like a success, until the flashes came, not in the water but over it. The first 155mm shells fell 60 meters ahead of the battalion, then 30, then none. The last series of shots exploded in the air, over the center of the formation. Within seconds, the ice was dyed red. There were no shouts of command. There was no crossfire, just the hollow sound of water being pierced by bodies with no reaction time. At dawn, American reconnaissance units encountered a scene of lethal geometry. The German corpses were arranged in a pattern that seemed drawn, circular bands like rings of a cut tree. The aerial explosion of the proximity fuse created a lethal beam of shrapnel that struck everything around it with near absolute accuracy. The effect was more efficient than mines, faster than gunfire, and more economical than bombardments. And on that frozen morning, exactly 702 dead were counted. 702 men, in a single night, without any direct combat having taken place. There was no resistance. There was no ambush. Just a sky calibrated by circuits, logic, and time. General George S. Patton, upon learning of the episode, recorded the event as the most accurate destruction of infantry I have ever seen documented. An entire division eliminated with less than 4 artillery pieces. Mathematics confirmed it. A single VT projectile, exploding 6 meters from the ground, could hit with fatal shrapnel a radius of up to 25 meters. In a marching formation, this meant dozens of soldiers neutralized by each shot. And with 4 batteries firing in coordinated sequence, it was possible to saturate areas of 300 square meters with continuous aerial fire for up to 20 minutes. What once required a bombardment was now solved with a coordinate spreadsheet. An operator, 1 shot, 10, 20, 30 dead. And he repeats. This was the new war. The irony was even more cruel when we remember that, until a few months earlier, the German High Command itself had ruled out the development of similar fuses. In 1940, Reich scientists presented the first concepts of fuses sensitive to electromagnetic variations. Hitler refused. The justification? It takes too long. This is science for after the victory. In 1944, the science he rejected was the same science that now turned bridges into tombs. Pause. A fact. By December 1944, American daily production of near-fused projectiles exceeded 40,000 units, an average of one lethal projectile every 2 seconds. Germany, in the same period, could barely produce 4,000 conventional grenades a day. The ratio was 10 to 1, and the difference in effectiveness was even greater. If this statistic surprises you, comment below with a word that sums up its impact. Absolute power, shocking data, or logistics wins. For those who lived through the crossing of the Sauer River, there was no debate. It was absolute power, and invisible. The psychological impact on the German commandos was immediate. Reports intercepted weeks later reveal explicit orders to avoid night crossings in areas known for VT use. The terror ceased to be emotional and became doctrinaire. The enemy controlled the sky, even without flying. The Americans, on the other hand, saw in it a brutal confirmation that modern warfare was won not by bravery, but by calculation. The question that arose was uncomfortable. It was effective, but was it fair? The commanders knew they were wiping out entire troops before any chance of combat had even. Soldiers who have never fired a bullet. A colonel of the 5th Division confessed in his diary, "We are no longer shooting at men, we are cleaning up zones." The line between tactical victory and massacre was beginning to blur, but war offers no pause for moral reflection, and while engineers calculated the next evolution, the Germans dug what they could, not to advance, but to survive. Because, on the horizon, something even bigger was approaching. If fuses had turned infantry into a fixed target, the next phase of the war would do the same to everything that moved on rails, wheels, or wings. America wasn't just winning the gift. He was preparing to dominate the future, inch by inch. The dense, silent Ardennes forest, covered by a roof of ancient pine trees, was always seen by the Germans as a natural ally. Its tangle of logs, fog, and hidden trails had offered shelter in 1940, when the Wehrmacht crossed the region with withering speed toward France. Now, 4 years later, the same generals hoped that this vegetable labyrinth would once again serve as a shield. The problem was that the shield had been inverted. The introduction of proximity fuses in American howitzers turned every tree into a trap. When a VT fuse-filled projectile penetrated the forest canopy, he didn't expect to hit the ground. His mission was to explode within a few feet of the canopies. And what followed was not just the scattering of metal shrapnel. It was a combination of shock waves, bark fragments, wood shards, sharp branches, and acoustic pressure that hit the German troops in multiple vectors. Each tree, once sheltered, now became a shard generator. The field reports describe an unprecedented phenomenon: soldiers being hit by invisible wooden projectiles, fragments of logs accelerated to lethal speeds, launched like natural blades. An explosion could generate hundreds of secondary punctures, many of them impossible to treat with frontline medical resources. The concept of natural cover no longer exists. The trenches dug under the shelter of the trees became temporary graves. A captured diary of a petty officer of the 18th Volksgrenadier records, "We were hit by the sky. The trees screamed. The wood cut like iron. The forest, which for centuries offered protection to the hunter, was now an accomplice to the hunt." It was the kind of inversion that destabilizes more than a defeat in the open, because it was not just a stronger enemy. It was a terrain that betrayed. The German doctrine of infiltration, shaped on the Eastern Front, was based on the idea of covering ground under bushes, forests, and valleys, moving with speed and silence. Now this doctrine turned against his own soldiers. The advance under dense vegetation, previously tactical, became an act of statistical suicide. The Americans knew this, and artillery maps began to prioritize forest zones. With fine-grained coordination, they calculated the average height of the treetops, adjusted the flight time, and fired with fuses calibrated for aerial detonation 3 or 4 meters above the top. The result was devastating. In entire sectors, the trees seemed to implode in series. There was no movement required. Just his presence was already a reason for shooting, and there was no possible counterattack. The German soldiers, upon noticing the pattern, tried to adapt. They dug deeper trenches. They began to move in more dispersed ranks, but American artillery had already predicted this, and with the observation units operating by radio, they adjusted the bursts in real time. All it took was a flash of a flashlight, a shadow moving in the snow, or a burst out of rhythm, and the sky responded. For many soldiers, the forest has become a field of panic. The sound of the wind shaking the trees was confused with the hiss of the projectiles. At any moment, the roof of the world could explode. And it exploded. In some areas, the Americans developed the practice of saturating forest areas even without confirmation of enemy presence. The calculation was simple. If there was the slightest chance of advance, it was better to detonate the air. The cost was less than waiting for direct contact. And so, the Ardennes, which in December 1944 seemed like a natural refuge for German strategy, became the greatest lethality multiplier of American artillery. The forest, which he once protected, now bled. And with that, the very concept of battle changed. Technology no longer just beat the enemy. She rewrote the rules of the environment. Geography, which for centuries had dictated the pace of war, now bowed to physics. The trench dug in the right place, the bush well positioned, the ravine that saved. All of this no longer matters. Modern warfare had figured out how to eliminate chance, how to arm the invisible, and in doing so, he killed more than soldiers. It killed doctrines. A German general captured in January would confess bluntly, "We didn't know where to step anymore, nor where to breathe." But if the sky had been armed with sensors, the ground was about to receive its own transformation, because the next turn was already underway, and it came on rails with mobile cannons ready to make distance an even more accurate weapon. Elsenborn Ridge, a modest elevation east of Liège, became in December 1944 the point where mathematics decided the fate of the 1st SS Panzer Division. For the Germans, that position was critical. It was the bottleneck that separated their armored columns from the advance towards Antwerp. For the Americans, it was the wall that could not collapse. And it did not collapse. For 3 consecutive days, the American line remained under alternating and synchronized bombardment, commanded by multiple artillery battalions, operating with surgical precision. There were more than 160,000 shots fired in 72 hours. Of these, approximately 40,000 used proximity fuses. But what was discovered later was even more impressive. These 25% of the shells caused more than 60% of German casualties. The reason lay in the relentless effectiveness of the airburst. While conventional firing required direct impact, or at least proximity to the ground, VT detonated above the formation, creating multi-directional cones of destruction. No cover helped. No safe position could stand. The formations of the 1st SS Panzer, hitherto seen as invincible, were reduced to silhouettes scattered in the snow. In many places, the bodies were not covered by earth, but by shrapnel of steel and pulverized wood, the result of explosions in the middle of the treetops. The American tactic was clear: synchronized dams. Instead of concentrating fire at specific points, dozens of batteries were distributed, firing with fuses, adjusted to create zones of denial, areas where it was impossible to survive for more than a few minutes. It was not a question of shooting to kill, but of preventing any advance. German companies were cut in half before they even knew where the Americans were, and when they tried to regroup, a new dam disintegrated them. The logic of the Blitzkrieg had been reversed. Speed, once a weapon, was now a death sentence, because the accelerated advance meant going straight into the saturation coordinates. American artillery did not respond to the attack. She anticipated him. Major Karl-Heinz Menger, commander of a company of the SS Leibstandarte, later reported, "Our men were not defeated. They were dissolved." Elsenborn Ridge wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a scientific demonstration, a field experiment where equations won over ideologies. With each beat of the stopwatch, a new shot was calculated, launched, adjusted. The soil was no longer geography. It was a millimeter grid, and the elite of the Nazi war machine discovered that you don't face numbers with faith. By the end of the 3rd day, the losses of the 1st SS Panzer exceeded 2,500 men. More than 60 tanks and armored vehicles had been abandoned, not for lack of fuel, but for lack of living crew. The ridge that should have been crossed in 6 hours was still in American hands, intact, and still shooting. The psychological impact was so profound that, for the first time since the beginning of the offensive, the German command considered a strategic retreat in the middle of the attack phase. There was no alternative plan, nor reinforcements, not even a miracle. There was only the brutal realization: the doctrine of continuous advancement had been held back by a silent equation. And every second, new batteries were being recalibrated, Because on the other end of the line the enemy did not sleep. He just calculated. January 1st, 1945. The dawn of the new year in the Ardennes was gray, drowned out by low clouds and the thick smoke of war. The Luftwaffe, in one of its last desperate attempts to turn the tide, launched its last air chart, Operation Bodenplatte. The plan was simple in theory and suicidal in practice. A large-scale attack on dozens of Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands in the middle of the new year, when the alert posts were supposed to be relaxed. About 900 German aircraft took off at the same time, flying at low altitude to evade radar and air patrols. The targets: stationed Allied fighters, hangars, conning towers, fuel tanks. The goal: to destabilize Allied air superiority. But the Luftwaffe lacked a technical detail that didn't exist in 1940. Proximity fuses had been incorporated into anti-aircraft artillery as well, and contrary to what the Germans expected, there would be no blind reaction from the Allied flak. There would be mathematics. The sensors of the Allied defenses no longer fired grenades expecting to hit the target by direct impact. Now the projectiles knew exactly when and where to explode. They just had to get closer. And with the density of fire around the airfields, that meant that every turn, every dive, every German climb was recorded, calculated, and detonated in real time. The American 90mm guns, distributed in the ground defenses, were equipped with the new fuses and operating with experienced operators. In many quarters there was no time for German reaction. The first squadrons were engulfed by aerial explosions before they even saw the targets. The space between the formations became a death corridor. What was once an evasive maneuver, climb, dive, spin, now only facilitated detonation. It was no longer the shot that had to reach the plane. It was the plane that activated its own sentence. Of the 900 fighters that departed, 172 were shot down within hours. 1 in 5 planes was destroyed by projectiles that never touched them. There were no traces. There were no missiles. Just dry bursts in the sky, followed by burning carcasses falling on the snow. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Germany had tested similar concepts as early as 1939, but abandoned the idea because it seemed technically unlikely or too slow. Now it was too late to copy. It is too early to understand. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and reconstructing the invisible gears of war, like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us to continue revealing what history has hidden under the rubble of technique. Operation Bodenplatte, which was supposed to be a masterstroke, turned out to be the last coordinated gasp of the Luftwaffe. Planes were lost. Experienced pilots were lost who could no longer be replaced. And they lost above all the notion of control of the heavens. For the first time, even the air was the enemy. And in the following hours, while the Allied airfields resumed operations without major damage, a new stage of the war emerged, where even the armored vehicles would fall victim to an invisible element, designed to kill before visual contact, because proximity fuses were about to become anti-tank weapons. As columns of smoke rose in the Ardennes, and the sounds of artillery echoed through the mountains of Belgium, the true force of American war did not roar in the fields. It whispered in the industrial sheds. Thousands of miles from the front line, away from the din of panzers and frozen trenches, an unseen army operated in silence. Civilian workers, in factories in RCA, Emerson, Sylvania, Western Electric, men and women who did not wield rifles but who assembled with absolute precision the 130 microscopic components that formed a single proximity fuse. Vacuum tubes, antennas, miniature oscillators, cells sealed with welds as thin as a hair, all of these required steady hands, trained eyes, and a kind of discipline that came not from the military hierarchy, but from the quiet responsibility of knowing that every mistake would cost lives. They didn't know exactly what they were building. Most had never heard of the term VT fuse. The information was compartmentalized, protected as a state secret, but they knew enough, that it saved soldiers, that each unit produced meant that a son, a sibling, or a neighbor would return home. The shifts were uninterrupted. 3 days a day. Some units delivered a new fuse every 2 seconds. Pregnant women worked standing up. Teenagers falsified documents to be accepted as assemblers. On certain lines there were improvised clean chambers, where dust control was as strict as in nuclear laboratories. In many cities, such as Baltimore and Rochester, entire neighborhoods revolved around these ghost factories. places where the final product was never discussed outside the gates and where people were taught not to ask questions. The order was simple: assemble, test, send, and repeat. It was the miracle of mass production applied to microelectronics, something that, until a few years earlier, did not even exist as a concept. If Germany represented the pride of academic science, laboratories, and renowned engineers, the United States showed there the power of applied science on an industrial scale. It was not enough to invent. It was necessary to multiply, and to do so under absolute pressure. In less than 6 months, the American production line was delivering more than 40,000 proximity fuses per day. This means that in a single day, they produced more units than the entire German research capacity on the same topic for 3 years. And it wasn't just quantity, it was quality control. Each fuse went through 3 batteries of tests: thermal, vibrational, electrical. One failure and the entire batch was discarded. The cost was high, but trust was non-negotiable. There was no room for error, because out there in the snow, a VT-fused projectile could decide whether a position would be saved or swept away. The war was being won by workers without uniforms, by engineers who slept on blueprints, by young men who welded components in absolute silence. Victory did not just come from the battlefield. It was shaped in the pencil sketches of the designers, in the drawing boards of the physicists, in the trembling hands of those who knew that time was not a variable. It was the enemy itself. This was the invisible factory, a front without an anthem, without a parade, without decorations, but with an impact as destructive as an entire battalion. Modern warfare required more than bravery. It required repetition. It demanded accuracy. And above all, it required faith, technical faith, industrial faith, moral faith, because those who built, even without understanding, believed. And perhaps this was the real secret weapon of the Allies. But if factories built the invisible, there was one statistic that had yet to be revealed, one that would seal the fate of the Battle of the Bulge and dismantle once and for all the myth of German invincibility. The cruelest irony of this story did not fall from the sky. It was drawn on paper 4 years before the Battle of the Bulge. In 1940, while the world was still trying to understand what modern warfare would be, engineers from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, were already working on the first concepts of programmable fuses by approximation. The idea was revolutionary: to replace the old mechanical time with a system that detected the target and exploded at the exact moment, without physical contact. Germany, until then a world leader in applied science, had the knowledge, the laboratories, and the brains to develop this technology. There were prototypes, there were tests, but there was also an obstacle greater than any engineering: Adolf Hitler's impatience. Obsessed with quick wins, Hitler rejected any project that did not deliver results within 6 months. Weapons that required technical development, production stability, and prolonged testing were abandoned, labeled as cabinet dreams. The design of proximity fuses was one of them. Cancelled, archived, buried under the urgency of now. In their place, they invested in grandiose rockets like the V-2, spectacular but strategically useless weapons. The Third Reich exchanged precision for spectacle, and he paid the price. Unlike the United States, which allowed its physicists to work for years in silence, protected by the bureaucracy of the system and faith in the process, Nazi Germany demanded miracles and propaganda deadlines. Science has become hostage to ideology. Time, the enemy of political marketing, was treated as a traitor, and the consequence was devastating. When the first German soldiers began to die from shrapnel falling from the sky, Wehrmacht technicians analyzed the shells and were in shock. They knew that concept. They knew it was possible. They knew, too, that they had given up on him. Germany, which before the war was synonymous with precision, calculation, and unbeatable engineering, now watched its doctrine being dismantled by an invention that it had rejected, not because of incapacity, but out of vanity, in a hurry, out of arrogance. It is the moral tragedy of modern warfare. The enemy has not been defeated by inferiority. It has been defeated by not trusting the time necessary to win. The German collapse was both technical and philosophical. The generals who bet on tanks, Blitzkrieg, and intimidation did not know how to react to an invisible war, guided by censors and mathematicians. And in the heart of the American trenches, no one celebrated. There was only amazement. Because the weapon that redefined the battlefield was not the result of sudden genius. but of the patience of thousands who believed what they could not see. That was the difference. While Hitler bet on symbols, the United States invested in systems. While Germany wanted immediate impact, America built gradual efficiency. And in that winter of 1944, that difference was already costing thousands of lives a week. A war is not won with soldiers alone. You win with time, with technical faith, with the humility of letting science take its course. But if this explains the collapse of German doctrine, there was still one last revelation. What happened to the Germans who survived the fuses? What they saw, what they reported, and how their memories would be silenced for decades. Because not every trauma explodes with shrapnel. Some remain alive, echoing in the silence of those who have returned to tell. When the first American shell exploded in the air without contact, single-handedly calculating the optimal moment to kill, the battlefield bid farewell to the purely mechanical era. World War II began with tanks crossing borders and bombers dropping charges by manual calculation. But it ended with sensors making decisions in real time. The proximity fuse, until then, only a metallic tube invisible to the eyes of the combatants, became the symbolic landmark of this transition. It was the first weapon to think. The first is not to depend on human aim, the time set by the scorer, luck, or statistics. It was automated precision, the first electronic eye of combat. Each detonation was a binary decision, to trigger or not to trigger, based on miniature radar readings processed in milliseconds. Without emotion, without hesitation, just calculation. That changed everything. Because war is no longer just physical destruction, it became a confrontation between intelligences. And in the Ardennes winter, the United States proved that its intelligence was greater than its arsenal. Mathematics has overcome brute force. The algorithm won over the doctrine. The impact was so profound that even the generals were slow to understand. George Patton, known for his cult of bravery and speed, declared that fuses had saved more American lives than any other invention of war. Eisenhower called them one of the 3 greatest secrets of victory. But the quietest acknowledgement came from the engineers. Laboratory men once ignored by strategy, now revered as architects of the impossible. Because the fuse wasn't just a weapon, it was the beginning of a lineage. All guided missiles, all drones, all of the smart weapons that populate modern arsenals today are descended from this technology. It was the harbinger of the informational age, an era in which sensors would replace soldiers, in which machines would be the first to see the enemy, and to decide with lethal precision what to do. The war finally had crossed the border from analog to digital, and it did so not with spectacular rockets, but with an 8-inch cylinder, assembled by anonymous workmen, adjusted by physicists in lab coats, and fired by a colonel who disobeyed orders to save men who would never know him. This was the moment when the soldier was no longer just on the front line. It came to exist on the drawing boards, in the formulas, in the calculating machines. America's victory there was not just industrial, it was epistemological, because he understood before others that he thinks, in war, it can be more lethal than shooting. But not everyone understood this in time, and the price of ignorance was high, especially for those who, even surviving the hell of the Ardennes, could never explain what they saw. Because the sound of artillery has changed, and with it, the nature of fear. And it is precisely this sound, high-pitched without warning coming out of nowhere, that still echoes in the accounts of the returning German soldiers. In the last part, we will hear from those who faced the impossible, what they said, what they remembered, and what was censored. Because the trauma of technology does not end with the explosion. It begins with silence. The Battle of the Bulge ended as it began, shrouded in fog but now laden with smoke, debris, and silence. Hitler's latest offensive, designed to reverse the course of the war, sealed its definitive failure. In just 6 weeks, more than 100,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. What began as an audacious coup ended in a total collapse, not just of a military operation, but of an entire doctrine. The Blitzkrieg, once a symbol of tactical efficiency and territorial dominance, had been defeated by a force it could not see, understand, or combat. The sky, which was previously only a scenario, had become the protagonist, and in every detonation suspended in the air, in every formation broken by an invisible explosion, it was evident, the thesis was proven. German supremacy was dismantled by vacuum tubes and mathematical calculations. For the ability of a democratic system to unite engineers, workers, and soldiers around a single mission, to win by thinking. The great lesson of this war, perhaps of all modern wars, is simple, brutal, and definitive. Logistics determine strategy. It is not enough to have the best soldiers, nor the fastest tanks, nor the most audacious generals. It is necessary to have the firm hand of the industry, the intelligence applied to detail, and the moral courage to invest in what does not yet exist. The Third Reich was not defeated by cannons alone, but by its own refusal to wait for the time of science. By canceling the development of his own proximity fuses in 1940, Hitler didn't just halt a project, he destroyed the chance of his own victory. The phrase of Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, said years later, echoes with irony and precision. We were defeated by workers who knew how to set up radio better than our generals knew how to command divisions. If you value serious research, forgotten details, and the search for historical truth, support this channel. Leave your like, subscribe, and activate the bell. This is what allows us to continue digging up the gears that really moved history. And in the comments, say, what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video? Because history is made of numbers, but it only turns into memory when we reflect on them. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.